I'd like to introduce our next speaker now, Dr. Stephanie Pfirman. Stephanie's the Hirschorn Professor of Environmental Science at Barnard College and Director of the Polar Learning and Responding Climate Change Education Partnership. Stephanie's scientific research focuses on the Arctic environment and particularly on the nature and dynamics of Arctic sea ice under changing climate. Her previous research activities have included melting and surging glaciers and pollution transportation by sea ice.
Thank you, Mary Beth. And so continuing on the communication about what are our communication strategies and what are our communication priorities. You see here on the left what Arctic sea ice has typically been like at the end of summer, our summer minimum after you've had the melting throughout the entire summer. On the right is where we'll be in 15 to 30 years. So it's a dramatic change. And what does this mean? How can we communicate this? What are the most important elements? Next slide. So I'm the lead on this Polar Learning and Responding Climate Change Education Partnership. Several of the people who are here today, Peter, Mary Beth, and Larry, are all members of this partnership, along with several other groups, including Hurtigruten Cruise Lines, which we had seen a slide from earlier. What we're doing is we're gathering together to create novel educational approaches to reach adults, including teachers, and through teachers we can reach students about the changing Arctic and what we can do to respond. And I'll show you some of these novel educational approaches that we'll actually have showcased so you can actually try them out yourself during the reception following this event. Next slide. So what is it that we want to communicate? You know, what are our communication goals? And Peter mentioned this 5-degree Arctic and a 2-degree world, and that basically breaks down into two sides. One is adaptation. You know, how can we adapt to the changing Arctic? What changes are we anticipating and what can we do to respond? And then the other part of it is how can we mitigate the changes? What can we do in terms of alternative energy, lifestyle changes? So the next slide. I'll show you what we're going to be, so first of all, we want to know what we want to communicate, and the second part is who do we want to communicate them to. So one of the interesting groups are people who have changed their minds on climate change and to see what is it that actually got them to change their mind. Because if we could do more of that, we would be in a very different place. So there was this sort of informal poll on Reddit, which generally is for sort of a younger audience than at least me and many of you as well. What they did was they asked people who changed their mind on climate change, what was it that made them change their mind, got them to change their mind? So it was nice to see science showed up there. So people were exposed to science, sometimes in a class, sometimes in a video or something that they saw, maybe in an event like this, and it woke them up and they said, there's something changing here, there's something that I need to pay attention to, and it kind of shifted their mindset. 29% of them said it's stewardship and care for the earth. So they thought about the long-term future. What is their legacy? What is the world that we're leaving to our children? You know, how can we better manage the resources that we have? And they realized that this is not the way that we've been handling things is not an appropriate way. And 21% of them talked about, as Larry just pointed out, the weird, warm, and wild weather that we've been experiencing. And many people connect that to the changes in the Arctic. It's something that actually in the scientific community, we're still doing research on this because there's a lot of variation in weather, and it's kind of hard to say, you know, it's the changes in the Arctic that are actually causing the changes that we're seeing in these lower latitudes. But in people's minds, they're actually making this connection right now. And I'll tell you some more ideas that they came up with in just a second. But first, I want to show you some of the ways that we're addressing these communication goals, in particular to people who might be willing to change their minds. So each of our activities that we'll show you during the reception, none of them say climate change in the title. So all of them say something about, you know, the changing Arctic or EcoChains or ecosystem or strategic management, but we don't come in and say this is a game or this is an activity focused on climate change, because then people who are already, you know, locked in their beliefs are just not going to pick it up and use it. So next slide. So one of our communication goals is that the Arctic is an ocean covered with thin ice. Who would have thought that this is an important thing to say? But there's a lot of reasons why it's important. As Larry said, you know, we know that Arctic sea ice is being lost. And the vulnerability of the Arctic to change, realizing that it's only ice basically as thick as I am tall that's causing is basically shielding the ocean from the atmosphere. It's reflecting this white surface that's keeping the northern hemisphere warm. It gives you a sense of just how vulnerable the Arctic actually is. So what we do is we have a jigsaw puzzle where people create, put the puzzle pieces down, and at first they don't even know where they are, and then finally they realize that this is the Arctic Ocean, and we say, is this what you expected to see, an ocean 2 miles deep in the center? And they said, no, I expected to see ice, and we say, okay, here's the ice piece, so next slide. So this is the ice extent, and we have them fit it over the jigsaw puzzle. We say it has to be floating. It can't be over any land masses, so that gets the point home. And this is basically what the ice extent was in 1980. Next slide. We then give them this next piece, and we say this is the ice the way it was in 2012. And so they fit that over it as well, and we talk about why the ice is coming out through Fram Strait east of Greenland, coming out with the current. And then we finally hand them the next piece. Next slide. And that's what it's going to be. And we hand that to them, and people actually don't want to take it. And this goes to that stewardship and care for the earth. We say, this is it. This is what it will be like in 2030, 2040, 2050. And we have them place it down, and we talk about why it's in this particular location. And it's really effective at alerting people to the changes that are happening and what we can expect in the future. Next slide. Another communication goal that we have, and Mary Beth mentioned this when she talked about musk oxen, and everybody talks about polar bears. That's what people think about. If you ask people, surveys have done this, they say, what image comes to mind when you think of global warming? People say a polar bear on melting ice, right? With ice melting out from underneath it. So how can we teach people about the rest of the Arctic ecosystem, all of the system changes that you've heard about here, the cascading effects of loss of ice and what impacts that has on the rest of the system? So we thought, what better way to do it than have people actually build a food web themselves? So next slide. So we developed this card game called EcoChains, Arctic Life, and you can test this out later on, where we have sea ice as the base, and then ice algae need the sea ice copepod zooplankton need the ice algae, Arctic cod needs the ice zooplankton, then ring seals, and then finally polar bears. And so you build this up, and the higher trophic levels need more sea ice. So you have to have the ice to slide under. But events happen, for example, carbon pollution, that melt the ice. Then part of your ecosystem is no longer viable anymore and has to migrate out of the game. But you can take actions. You can use alternative energy. You can use carbon capture and sequestration to try to accelerate the ice to come back. And so you actually have the sense of taking actions that your actions matter. Next slide. So we've done some research on this, and it's really interesting. You don't have to look at the small words on here. In the initial survey that we did of people who were exposed before they read an article that had the same content as the game or played the game, we asked them, what species come to mind when you think of the Arctic? And what you see in the purples here are polar bears and seals. In orange are penguins. So guys know, no penguins in the Arctic, right? Okay. So then we had them play the game or read the article, and we said, now what species did you learn about? And this is what they had. First of all, no penguins, so we did a good job with that. Krill, algae, fish, plankton, and human beings came into the picture. And there was no difference between the people who played the game or read the article in terms of what their responses were. So this shows that games are just as good as articles, as reading in terms of teaching, which is first of all very interesting. But the really interesting thing happened 4 weeks later. We did a survey, and the ones who played the game remembered plankton, algae, krill. Before they got to the polar bears, those were the species. We said, what did you learn by the activity? The ones who read the article reverted back to their prior knowledge. Polar bears and seals showed up. They did learn a little bit down here, but the initial species that came to mind were the ones that they already knew. So playing a game is actually more effective in terms of long-term learning than reading an article on the same topic. Next slide. And the really cool thing about this was actually it also helped people feel more agentic, like there was more things that they can do. So the ones who played the game could think of more ways that they could help, and the ones who read the article actually felt less in control. And we think that they were reading about all these issues, and they actually became angry. In gray, you can see they became more angry, whereas the ones who played the game felt less angry, and they felt that they wanted to learn more, and they actually told their friends about the experience and the game more than those who read the article. Next slide. So this is one novel educational approach that we've done research on that shows that it's effective. Another thing that we've been working on is also to get people to understand the multiple stakeholder priorities. You've been hearing this, and you've been seeing in Yuli's presentation and everyone's presentation that we need a mix of strategies for development of the future. Sustainable development of the future doesn't mean putting it off as a protected area. People live and work there, and they're going to continue to live and work there. So we wanted to come up with a way for people to understand that is there a mix of priorities, and how can they literally map them out, as Håkan mentioned, geographic information systems. You can actually come up with management plans by mapping things out. Where are people's priorities? So we have people come together, and you'll be able to see this too. We give them roles, and they actually physically, it matters, they actually have to claim certain areas on a map. And then where there's overlapping claims, they have to talk through, what are your priorities, what are your interests, and then how can we resolve all of these? Next slide. So what we find is that people, first of all, have a lot of fun. And when people have fun, they're much more open to problem solving, they're much more open to new ideas. So that's important. The other thing is that people begin to visualize the complexity of the issue, but they also feel, again, more agentic. They feel more positive that there's a possibility to work out solutions. Next slide. So in terms of changing minds on a changing climate, next slide, or next click. You can see that we had talked about these other factors up here before. The final factor, which was really interesting, was also that climate denial increasingly appears to be untrustworthy. And what they mean by that is if you look at the people who are denying climate, many times they're funded by people from the fossil fuel industry. Next slide, or next click. What they also said was, in addition to a specific catalyst shifting their mindset, it was also a conversation with a peer or a trusted expert that helped people to get their questions answered. And this goes directly to what Larry had said, that friends and family are often seen as the trusted experts. Next slide. So this shows his slide here again. Friends and family are second only to scientists. And so what you're doing here today, coming to learn about this subject, is critically important. Because next slide, or next click, 7 in 10 Americans rarely or never discuss global warming with their family and friends. Even when they're concerned about it, they just don't do it. And so I think the best thing that you can do is come to a forum like this so you can learn more about it. Go back and talk with family and friends, because through that, we'll be able to normalize climate change action. Thank you.